So everybody, welcome, or welcome back to the Nature Journal Educators Forum about our topic this week, which is dealing with kids who are nature reluctant, and more specifically with kids who are screen time addicted. So first of all, one question that might be good to talk about is what makes kids nature reluctant? And then we can talk about screen addiction specifically. But what kind of factors do we think make kids nature reluctant? Or have you heard kids talk about?
I think the biggest one that I've seen kids I've worked with is kids who know how to entertain themselves and how to look for things to do out in the woods. They tend to be much less, adverse to going outside and engaging than kids who just are unfamiliar. I mean, it's a typical thing with kids. If they don't know how to do something or, new foods, new experiences, there tends to be some resistance. But I feel like you really see it where you have a situation where you turn kids loose in an open space, and the ones that go run off and are like, we are creating a little game where we trade sticks. I'm like, great, good job, guys. Versus the ones who are kind of like, can we go in? When are we done? So yeah, I think part of that is engaging, learning how to play, learning how to be inquisitive without that being a guided thing where there's things just being fed to you to entertain you.
Mm-hmm. Definitely being able to have that creativity and that drive to create your own stuff, like you're saying about the independence.
Yeah. It's how to be bored.
And then another thing that you mentioned is kids not knowing what to do. So kids who, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, or maybe it was last week, nature literacy. Mm-hmm. So if you have kids who weren't exposed from a young age, then maybe they might have more trouble because they don't feel like they fit in when they go to the wilderness. They're not familiar, like you said. So nature literacy might be another reason why kids are more nature reluctant. Maybe in a bit we can talk a bit more about how to increase nature literacy. What do you think, Chris? What do you notice?
My experience with nature reluctancy is that a lot of kids, even the ones that live up here near Yosemite, don't have access very often, oddly enough. And they put it on what kind of like a sour grapes thing. They haven't spent time doing it. People expect that they know a lot about nature, but they don't. I think a lot of preparation time spent ahead of the visit is really good at structuring it from the beginning, and then easing off on structures, helps with the high school age kids that I deal with. Yeah. So that they, and also, I even structured when they could have a treat, and all this in the very beginning of the day, but we spent the whole day in Yosemite. And there are a lot of high schoolers that are lost when they get up there. They don't know where to go. They're not even used to just sitting on the ground to sketch. They're just, and you have to get over a lot of those kinds of things. So it's a long drive. We'll clear out, did a lot of fun stuff on the way, stuff we might see. You just have to build up interest, just like with little kids, maybe even more than with kids. And set the expectation level for them not too high, so they won't be let down when they don't see a bear or that kind of thing, because it's mighty hard to predict.
That's a good point about not setting the expectation too high, especially that makes me think of sort of what Jack talks about sometimes as priming. Yeah. Because they're older, they might have had already more experiences, whether it be watching a movie or hearing, legends or urban rumors, whatever, but they have an idea already a bit more concrete in their head about what nature is, even if they haven't experienced it very much.
Right. My expectations when I was a kid was that it was going to be like Bear Country, the Disney movies, that I was going to see up close all these animals. And you really have to try hard. And then once there's a sighting, there are so many ways that animals can be, just what we were talking about before, they can be scared off, or you can do damage without even knowing it, just so you do have to lay a lot of ground rules. And largely when I took them out, we started with landscape etos, and let's draw leaves, let's draw, identify some small things, and then work up to bigger vistas and talking about what caused all this, or what do let's see what we can see rather than here's what we're going to see. And I think frequent breaks to talk with them as a group was really good. I do allow them to take their iPhones because it's a camera, and so you have to monitor that, but I don't have to worry about screen time because of course there's no Wi-Fi. But I encourage them to take photographs, and that helps. They do a lot of sharing of their photographs on the way home, and they're comfortable with that. So that is a start, and they know they could use it later to add to their notes.
The thing that strikes me about what you just said is that on the way home, they'll share pictures with each other. And I think that having that reflection time is important. So that way you're not just having an experience and then going home, but actually sitting down and talking about it with each other, because then that makes it a group experience properly when the group is talking about it and sharing the feelings that they might have had. And so then it becomes a group value that they all.
It's even more with, I taught school for so many years. I would flip all their photos into a little slideshow, and we'd show it to the rest of the class when we got back. And I had 7 classes a day, and the kids that went would always narrate it. So there's even more learning with that, and sharing, what they drew and all of the above.
Yeah, right. Out of curiosity, and this is something I think any of us could answer, what were our first experiences with nature, and who introduced us to those? Do you all remember?
Oh, geez.
I think it was just being set loose.
Yeah, we were out in the dirt since we could walk,
Yeah.
I mean, my first babysitter was a donkey.
Or a dog.
Donkey
You might
was
have to-
dog. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we were raised outdoors, so
Actually, our only babysitters.
that's true. Our only babysitters have been animals. I don't think anyways. So yeah, that's a great part of nature literacy. But I think we have a unique childhood in the sense that we had a sense of independence that a lot of kids don't get, of like learning to manage ourselves in this environment and learn how to interact with animals. The other thing is, I feel like just being able to see and notice things is a learned skill. I actually noticed this while dating, because my typical first date is to go get coffee and go for a walk. And I notice all these birds, all these plants. I think a big part of it is because I know how to look and to look. So I've noticed a lot of people when they go for a hike, like they're just sort of on this one track thing of like, oh, we're walking through here, like that may be pretty in general, but I'm not like looking for anything specific. And I mean, I remember traveling with some people who I was doing like some history stuff with, and they thought it was crazy because we were walking through this like old plantation, and I was just like scanning, and they're like, what are you doing? I'm like, well, I'm using scatter vision to try and like detect movement in the trees to spot birds. Like, you're insane. No, I'm not. It works. See, because like I hear the sound, and then I try to like look in general direction and like look generally to try and like find movement, and then like, yeah, exactly. So like you've got a skill then of like, this is how you notice birds. Like you listen, you look like this, and then like if you have binoculars, you use that scatter vision, and then you like aim the binoculars, and like there's a whole skill to it. And once like, I mean, I think we do that anytime we're outside, like we're constantly like looking, and it really changes how we interact with the environment. Like we go tide pooling, we go out on a dock, like we are constantly like looking for something
Yeah, and I don't think that's something that's really ever taught, even in a nature education setting. Like you don't teach that specific skill. And I think also with sort of handling animals and just your normal conduct in a nature environment, like an outdoor environment, is something that you very much learn from experience growing up, just out of doors.
Yeah.
And so I think kind of modeling, this is how you behave, like these are the things that you should be afraid of, and modeling like these are the safe ways to interact with animals and with plants and stuff respectfully in a way that's safe for the animal and for you, and just sort of showing this is what's safe, because I think a lot of the fear of the outdoors is just not knowing how to conduct yourself.
Yeah, especially even think about like terrain and whatnot. Like people are very used to like having a place like this is a designated place where I can walk. We've got sidewalks, we've got paths. And then when you do the option of like, oh, let's go off trail, let's climb on things, like when
That's
you watch
something that
people,
you've been taught not to do.
well,
Yeah.
yeah, also, but then you look at like how they move and their bodies and how they think about like spatial awareness. Like for me and you, I mean, we're very aware of like, you know, our bodies and how that works, and we're not afraid to like get down on our hands and knees to like scramble over things like feral creatures. We are feral creatures. But yeah, I mean, it's a foreign environment, and I think especially with the way that we have screens becoming such a big part of our conscious daily life, like the element of searching and looking for things has been replaced by find the next stream that will continually bring the like stimulation to me. And I'm trying to figure out how to like detach myself from that a little bit, because the effects of it just I notice on myself from my own like willing interaction with a lot of online stuff. I mean, it's made to be addictive, and it's made to like streamline you into that type of thinking and seeing.
Yep.
I agree. The screens are about instant gratification. You get on it and it punches you right in the dopamine. You're like, woohoo.
I think one of the things we notice is like when we try and play video games, I feel like we almost get kind of overstimulated by it. It's like, okay, we have to put this down now because it's like too busy. Yeah.
I think kids today are often overscheduled too.
Definitely.
There's special classes they need to take, and people want to know where they are more often and what they're doing, what they're up to. I mean, it seems to me, I mean, I'm a lot older than you folks, but when I was a kid, from the breakfast table to the dinner table, pretty much you were on your own, or you were in school, you know, and you were kind of on your own there too. Recesses were not monitored. Our playground was a beach, so we could go out and wade in the water if we wanted to. There wasn't, you know, no one was afraid of nature back then, or afraid of us doing anything to hurt ourselves or each other. It was a different time and place. So you had a lot more downtime to just play and visualize. I think parents set the tone too for kids' interaction with nature. If they don't do it, the kids don't.
Yeah.
And I think parents can also set a tone that you don't do things unless you've had a class in it or you've had training in it. I experienced that with some of my nieces and nephews. And they keep going, well, how did you learn how to do this? Well, I just did it. You know, we were a lot bolder in our childhood back then, I think. There were fewer things to fear. Yeah.
Plus, I'm guessing that in your childhood, y'all weren't made to sign a bazillion waiver forms.
No.
So you wouldn't hold whatever
No.
organization or person accountable should you have an accident out in nature.
Right. My dad always said, what my mother would sometimes say, oh, don't let them do that. That's dangerous. And he said, they'll find out.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. They'll find out. And that's a better learning than you telling them. Yeah.
That's
So,
another thing is I think that kids who have like nature literacy and are able to have that sort of unstructured time to like explore and
right.
develop and learn to make decisions and manage their own environments have a lot better like risk perception later on.
Yep.
Because for a while,
Yep.
like college, I lived with some people who kind of had the typical like suburban childhood with very scheduled, very structured sort of lives. And I noticed that like as I broke away from parents, like they just sort of really like tested all these boundaries in ways that I wouldn't really think to do. Um,
Yeah.
but there was one other person who kind of had in some ways a similar thing with being able to run outside. And we both, with risky behavior that you typically see in college students, like with drinking, with, you know, going out late and doing stupid things, like we didn't really do any of that. Because we're kind of like, yeah, you know, we know our limits. Like we don't really need to go out and do that thing. And I think it really gives you a better sense of like self and like self-regulation.
Yeah. Who am I? I am this person who can do these things. And I try, you know, and that's how I know. Yeah. I think that that's wonderful. When I was thinking back to how I learned about nature, I mean, I was turned loose in a small dinghy, 5-foot dinghy, sailing dinghy, and just pushed out into the water to go wherever the wind would blow me. And you learn fast, and it really it makes a big difference how you perceive the world when you can make something happen like that sail fill up and I can get somewhere. And certainly there were a lot of adults around doing the very same thing at the time, but eventually we were all turned loose to go places like that, you know, either on our bicycles or walking or in a small boat.
That rarely exists for children right now. I mean, one thing I love about the town that we're in right now is that there's all these lovely interurban trails that are safe for kids to kind of like roam loose on. And I just love seeing kids in packs out and about doing things in the neighborhood, because I feel like that's such a rarity these days. And meeting kids in this area who have that sense of agency, and it's so cool.
Yeah. Hi, Billy Joe.
I'm glad you're here. So hello, Billy Joe, and hello.
I am too. It looks like you're muted though.
I think folks can.
Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry I'm late. It's just been a bit of a day, so I really apologize. Oh my gosh, I feel terrible. I'm so sorry.
No worries, Billy Joe. We're so happy you're here, and everybody has those kinds of days, so we're just happy to see you. We were talking about how kiddos, when the kiddos have grown up sort of in nature, that they tend to have better risk perception because of the experimenting, and about how it's good to have unstructured playtime outside. And so a thing I was going to ask is that if you are, okay, I'll take myself for example. I'm from a city, and I'm not sure how much or how little nature literacy my parents had or have. Because being in a city, I'm not sure if it's that they had nature literacy, but I didn't have places to go out and play aside from the playground, or it's that they didn't have nature literacy and wouldn't have let me anyway, even if we did. But as a bit older, then I might be a little bit more hesitant to explore than I would be as a kid. For one thing, because I have more aches and pains in my body. And I think that if I fell as a kid, I'd probably recover a lot faster than if I fell as an adult. But another thing is that having already some ingrained habits that I would probably have to unlearn. So this might seem like a kind of a silly question, but if you were to say really basic things that are risky in nature versus things that I might perceive as risky but that aren't, what kind of things would you say for somebody who is new?
Ooh. Okay, well,
walking around barefoot.
Yeah, that's actually a good thing. The other thing is exploring new spaces on your own. Like obviously have kind of like a safety plan. You can incorporate this with nature journaling. that would actually be a good thing to do with kids, is having them be able to map out an area and not tell them like where we're going. Is like, we have a general area, you guys like tell us where we're going, and like try and remember where, or map out where we've gone. But yeah, spatial literacy and kind of like trusting your instincts a little bit, or learning how to like look at like, okay, I know that this landmark is in this direction, and then if I get lost, I can always like look at this and orient myself, or things like that. That one was a big one for me.
I think like with walking around barefoot, because we did that, especially I did that all the time as a kid. Like I had rock hard soles.
Yeah, me too. They're like yellow.
Yeah, but like it
Sorry, that's
teaches
gross.
you it teaches you how to be aware of your surroundings in a
Mhm.
way that is very different, because it's very tactile and it's very immediate. Like if you aren't keeping half an eye on where you're going, you're going to end up with pain. But at the same time, there's these really just visceral kinetic joys that come with that. And it's really interesting watching people who really haven't had that before try that for the first time. I remember when I was probably 8th grade, I had this one friend who
Nathan?
he was very scheduled. He didn't really spend a lot of time outside. And he just came over to our house, and we had like a big yard. And I was just like, cool, we're going to take off our shoes and we're going to walk around. And it was just a completely alien concept to him. And so I was just like leading the way and showing him where to step, and like walking through mud and everything. And he was shocked. We had like such a good time. And you could tell it was this completely alien thing to him, to be able to think about what he was doing in this way.
That's cool. That you were able to introduce him that way, and help him step a little bit outside of his comfort zone, literally into the mud, and to have a good time with that. I think it's important to be able to have friends like that who can show you the way if you haven't experienced it before. And Billy Joe, I see that your hand is raised.
Yeah, I was just thinking, walking off trail, right? And I think that there's two sort of parts to that. And one is that depending on your space that you're in and how like important or vital species that live there, then it's important to stay on the trail. But there's also spaces where it's totally okay to walk off trail, and you have to learn how to do that. And learn, talk about spatial literacy or spatial awareness is like, I teach my kids is like, you have to, mind your face, right? Like push those things, those tree branches out of the way, and then not just to let them go and whack the person behind you with those tree branches, right? So being mindful and communicating when you're sort of walking, through the bush, I think is something that I look at as is perceived risk. I mean, there is risk. Obviously, you can get a tree in the eyeball, things like that. But I think if you've mitigated that risk as much as possible and done those lessons, then I feel like it's a pretty non-issue. And the other one is playing near bodies of water, depending on who is there and what is there. I remember being a kid. I mean, it's a classic example of like, I don't know if I would let my kids do this, but my parents totally did, which is that I remember distinctly being in a pond up to like my waist alone, catching frog eggs and looking and discovering what was in the pond. And I mean, that's just not something that we look at nowadays as being like okay to do for a plethora of reasons. But I don't know, my parents thought it was totally fine for me to be doing that on my own. So, I think that we can teach our kids that there's lessons, right? Like obviously if they've never been around a body of water before, then that risk is a lot higher. If you've exposed them to those things and you've talked about the risk and you've talked about the safety procedures, then I think it's okay for them to explore certain bodies of water and spaces and things like that too. So I think a lot of lessons come into play. We get a lot of city kids coming up to the field centers as well. Today's a great example. We had like, I don't know, 16 kids come up today, and they, you know, we're talking about nature-averted kids, and all of them had cell phones, and all of them were really dedicated to videotaping their entire day. And my colleague Sarah was like, what is happening? And they're like, can we videotape this? Can we videotape this? And sometimes she was just like, no, I want you to be in the space. And they said, yeah, but how are we going to remember it? And she's like, because you've experienced it, like you've done it, so your mind will remember. So there's like, you know, so these interesting kind of things um, that you know, we sort of see and things like that. So yeah, I think there's a big thing with, you know, that sort of perceived risk and actual risk.
I think, go ahead, Chris. And then
Well, I remember one of the things, I worked at scout camps, but when I first went to a scout camp, I think 7th grade, one of the things we learned from one of the camp directors was always look over a log before you jump, because there might be a snake. And as a demo, you know, she did that and there was one. And we really, that came home to us. It could be anybody's home when you're off a trail, you know. And yes, and I loved the experience of being a counselor. I stayed on for every summer through high school and even college. So that was my nature, big nature thing. So ignore the phone.
a thing that this conversation is making me think about is acceptable risk too, in that sometimes, especially, I don't know how much you go into telling kids about this, but it's good, I think, to keep in mind if you're leading kids that there might be minor injuries. And I say that, for example, when I was a kid, I didn't necessarily get to go out a ton into nature, like the most was Golden Gate Park, but every summer I would go up for a few days with my dad up to my Nana's place, which was in southwestern Washington, outside of this little town called Chehalis. And so my Nana had a river running through her backyard, or stream. And so from an early age, that was what we would do during the summer, is we'd walk up or down the river. And so a risk that always was there was stepping on a very slippery rock and falling in. And that was a thing that would happen to all of us at some point or another. Sometimes we might bang up a knee or a shin. Other times, you know, nothing bad might happen except that we'd get super wet. But over time, it became a lot easier to not mind that. It wouldn't be the sort of thing where you would fall over and then go, oh, the day's ruined. It would just be kind of like, oh, okay, I fell in again. But having that in mind when teaching kids that there might be a small little risk that they might have, or maybe they're walking on a landscape that might be a little bit gravelly. And so then as long as it's not a super steep slope, if they fall down for a second, then they might get a little scrape. And then you say, okay, here, let's bandage you on up. And then you kind of keep going. And so sort of learning that there might be some risks that aren't exactly pleasant, but they're not really life-threatening either. And they're part of being outside, or, you know, getting a splinter or something like that. So I don't exactly know how you do that with the kids, except for, you know, showing them that it's okay. Go ahead, Kate.
Yeah. The other thing I think to think about with that is like teaching kids how you respond when things go wrong. Because I mean, one of the things the kids being out exploring on their own stuff is that when something minor goes wrong, they have to deal with it, and they learn to like deal with it instead of just get upset and wait for someone else to come fix it. I mean, Claire and I ran around with skinned knees for most of our childhood, and that was just sort of an accepted fact of life. I think there's a lot more stigma against that. I mean, I don't know if people, like I remember in high school when I wore shorts to school and I'd been sailing and I had bruised all over my legs, and I got held back after class to ask if I was being abused at home. I was like, oh no, this is just from like, you know, roughhousing outside. So I think the hardest part with that would be like explaining that to parents and stuff, that like, you know, things happen, it's okay. Like we will make sure that like nothing life-threatening happens. But I think having things go wrong and allowing kids the freedom to address it themselves and sort of like take stock and go like, okay, this thing happened, what do I do? And giving them tools to deal with it. Like, okay, if you slip, like put your hands out and like, this thing, or like with horses, I mean, people are like, oh, what do you fall off? I'm like, well, you will fall off at some point. I mean, there's things you can do, like if like not to like stick your limbs out there and like roll into a ball, get clear of the horse, like all these things, like things will go wrong. The best thing we can do is learn how to manage those situations instead of just being constant avoidance, because I don't think the constant avoidance and safeguarding really helps anyone. It just keeps you from doing things.
It's true. It's sort of the whole thing, the whole quote that we hear sometimes, but it's how you get up that counts, not that you fell. Also, I'm not sure if it's just something that our group of friends had when I was younger, but there was this kind of sort of culture that we had as a kid where if you got a scar, then that meant you had a cool story to tell everybody else. Or I remember I remember as a kid, I used to take horseback riding and I did get thrown off a horse. And then it became one of my best stories for a few years. I was like, yeah, I got thrown off a horse and this is how it happened. And so sometimes if you kind of have kids who are excited about whatever rough and tumble thing they got into, that can make it a little bit easier too, because then you make it so that it's not necessarily a huge stigma to have that happen to you. It's just kind of like, oh, I lived.
Have fun badges.
What, sorry? I part of.
Our grandmother would call our scabs fun badges.
I like that. I like this idea of fun badges. And what were you going to say, Billy Joe?
So two things. So when I first had my kiddos, I was always worried, right? Like when they started walking and stuff, like, oh, people are going to think exactly what happened to Kate, right? That oh my gosh, they're being abused or something like that, they're full of scratches and everything like that. And my doctor, when I came in, I said, oh, they fell or whatever. And he said to me, right point blank, he said, I will be more concerned when I don't see all of these scratches and bruises all over their legs. And I was like, affirmed, right, that I am doing a good job. And I thought to myself, I kind of always think about that now is like, yeah, they're supposed to, they're kids. That's what they're supposed to have on them is scratches and scars and bruises, because that means that they have been having fun and they've been out living that life. And so there's a couple of things when the kids come to the field centers. I like to have a really good time with them and kind of get them laughing, but get my point across at the same time. And so there's an activity that we do called Instincts for Survival. And basically it's like a herbivore, carnivore, omnivore game that I'm sure most of you have played. And they have to run around through the forest, and we have a section of forest blocked off, but there's no trails. Like the only trails that are there have been created over the years from the kids. Like it's just full in the forest running. And so we always have to talk about what happens if you get hurt. And I always say to them, like, you can call for help. But I was like, help is 911. I was like, this help means that I'm going to run through the forest. And I was like, I don't run, right? I only run in things deathly chasing me. And so then I said to them, like, I don't want to be running through the forest and then get to you. And then you have an owie, right? A little owie, a little raspberry scratch. And then they're all giggling and stuff. And I said, no, like, I'm serious, right? Like, if you're not, something's not broken, something's not deathly bleeding and spurting, and something's not broken, you're fine. Like, you're going to be fine. And they're like, looking like, I can't believe she's saying this to me. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm totally saying this to you because I'm like, I don't care about your owies. And they're like, what? And I'm like, no. I said, your mama can kiss that when you get home. I said, I'm not your mom today. I said, if it's bad enough, and I said, you really need a Band-Aid, I said, I'll give you a Band-Aid. I said, but other than that, you're going to be fine, and I said, they laugh, and it's like big joke and stuff. And I said, I do care. But I said, that's not 911 emergency, is like a little raspberry scratch, right? And so I feel like when they come back, some of the kids will have like mosquito bites and they'll have scratches and whatever. And I'll be like, you okay? And they're like, yeah, totally fine, just an owie. And I'm like, brilliant, right? Like, it's good. You sort of set that tone to be like, this is an acceptable amount of, injury. And this is where we move into like the unacceptable. This is like emergency status sort of thing. And it creates like, I always find like it's fun. It doesn't make it too scary when you talk about, what could go wrong out there, when you try to joke about it and sort of have a good time. And luckily, I always say to them too, like, let's remember it's a game and we're not going to put ourselves at risk to not get tagged, because what's the worst case scenario that's going to happen in the game? You lose a life, right? Well, that's better than spraining an ankle, right? So there's all these things that you kind of set it up within the parameters of the game, have fun with it, but really, beating that message in that it's, this is an emergency and these are our owies, and this is, there's sometimes an in-between marker as well. And I find the kids are really great with that, and just sort of being like, oh yeah, okay, all right, all right, all right. Otherwise, if you don't, I mean, I remember when I first started working here like 10 years ago, I was running through that forest so many times because a kid was like, literally, I had been scratched by a raspberry bush. And I was like, it's not an emergency like this. I literally thought you were dying, and this is what's happening. And the whole, like, there's this sense of panic because someone's calling for help, and you're like, literally, there's not even blood. Like, honestly, like, we're totally fine. And so now I'm just like, nope, setting that standard before you even get outside. And I do the same thing with my kids. They're like, they come home and they're like, I need ice. And I'm like, no, you don't. And they said, well, they give us ice at school. And I said, do you want to know why they give you ice at school? I said, to stop you from complaining. And they're like, Mom. And I'm like, that's exactly why they're giving you ice. I said, because there's either anything swollen. No. Are you bleeding? No. I said, does it require a Band-Aid? No. I go, what do you need ice for? You need ice to stop complaining. And I said, that is the only reason that teachers are giving you ice at school. It's to make you stop complaining. I said, now my kids don't ask for ice anymore. Because I'm just like, I'm not, this is ridiculous. Like, you can learn to suck it up because you're going to be fine. It's no different with the mosquitoes outside. I'm like, well, you're going to get bit by a mosquito. And then I'm like, if you're flailing around, it's going to make it worse. And I'm always like, what's the worst case scenario that's going to happen today? You are going to be left with a red mark that's itchy, but you will go home. You will get up tomorrow morning. You will live to see another day. It's just a mosquito bite. And so I'm really like quite frank with them, but sort of in a joking around way. And it tends to sort of take some of that away and get them to be like, oh, okay, this is normal. I'm not going to die. Everything's going to be fine. And then we can kind of proceed with having a really great day. So those are some things that I do, right or wrong. I don't know. I mean, I always have fun with it. So I hope that it's good.
Yeah.
I think it's good to be able to look and sort of model what, acceptable risks versus, life-threatening or long-lasting kind of risks. So it's good to think about that with the modeling and also the humor.
Yeah, they need to know that it's going to be okay, right? And the things that I'm ready to panic about are the things that are really serious. And if I'm not panicking about it, then they really shouldn't be panicking either. Now, that's not meaning that I'm going to tell them that they can't cry, that they doesn't hurt. We're just going to put that into like a mind frame of like, where are we at sort of on that scale, right? Like, yes, that hurt. Yes, you can cry. Absolutely, you're going to have emotions about that. But we don't need to let it ruin our entire day because we got a mosquito bite or because we got a little scratch. So I always hope that it seems to work, and it's been working for a really long time, just to sort of laugh about it, and then we can have those conversations around it.
The other thing I think that does is it gives them tools that they can use to apply to those situations and assess things themselves and be like, oh, okay, this thing happened and this is the appropriate response.
Mm-hmm.
Continuing to give them tools to like handle themselves and any challenges in their environment is probably more important than just saying like, no, don't do this. Like, say, you are aware of where your feet are and wear the right shoe, then you'll stay safe against snakes. And like, this is how we stay safe. And like, you can go and walk in tall grass, but you're going to do that, wear your boots,
Mm-hmm.
or, just watch where your feet are, or just basic stuff like, if you are going to take this risk, this is how you mitigate that risk. Or like, this thing happens, this is how you respond, instead of just immediately going into that flailing, like panic, help me mode.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And I think education is a big part of that as well. Like, we had some kiddos here the other day and we were doing some insect studies, and I would say like, how many people like insects? And I was like, nobody likes insects. And then we go catch them for like an hour and a half, and all of a sudden everyone thinks they're cool. And then we come back into class and an insect lands on a kid, and each boy has, like a mental, just breakdown, like tears, the whole thing. And his mom was here and she was like, you just spent an hour and a half catching them. And it was like he needed to like inwardly have that conversation of, oh yeah, right. And nothing bad happened. And she was like, right.
Yeah.
And then it was like he could take a deep breath and be like, I've already experienced this. So there I can take that and then move that forward, right? And be able to do that. And then I think sometimes even being able to have stuff prepared for kids as well. So here at the field center, it's like, you know, a kiddo showed up the other day in flip-flops. And we were like, you can't go play instinct survival in flip-flops. So here's some socks, here's some boots, and we're gonna get you sorted out, right? And here's some bug hats that you can wear, and here's a long sleeve shirt to help you protect against the mosquitoes. And and that gives them skills to hopefully is that next time, they go to a, field center or outside, they're like, oh, right, these are, kind of like what Kate was saying, like these are the appropriate things that I need in order to be successful outside and to be comfortable outside.
Yeah, that's really important thing too. And I think that largely is about like involving the parents, because I think especially people who maybe live in an urban only environment, you don't necessarily think about like, oh, this is what sensible shoes means. It's something comfortable to walk in that like, maybe a little water resistant or like checks all these boxes. And clothes I need to be able to like sit down, I need to be able to move comfortably, like moisture wicking, and like, if we're going out, like we've got the whole checklist of like, well, we've got, from yours is just the whole thing of like, okay, what do we wear? Do we wear like the canvas pants that will protect against this and this? Like how much, like, it's a whole thing. And that's your preparation is a big part of it. And I think a lot of kids maybe don't even have that agency to choose like, oh, what am I going to wear today in response to the environment I'm going to be in? And that's an important choice. Let's dictate your comfort.
Exactly. I think that's a huge thing right there is the parents and where they come in. The parents might not have prepared the kid in advance with the correct gear. Maybe there's some gear that the parents can't afford, or maybe they don't know where to go get it. And so being able to model that and also being able to know where to send parents is important, so that way they know where to go and they know also what's affordable. And I'm wondering if anybody has experienced sort of a thing where the parents are the ones pushing for the thing like the minor scratches as being a big deal to them. If they've ever experienced parents who just get really upset by really minor things, and so then they kind of set the tone for their kids about what risks they accept. Out of curiosity.
I haven't had too many parents come here that have experienced that. Most of the parents that come on the trip are usually pretty good, but I'm only making assumptions based on the kid's reaction to it, if that makes any sense, right? Like if the kid is overreacting, then that usually makes me think that a parent sometimes overreacts to that as well. But again, that's an assumption that I'm making. And so that could be true, or that could just be a really sensitive kiddo at the same time, right? So sometimes it's having to look past that and just, dealing with the kiddo in that moment, trying to get them to calm down, and then trying to get them to be like, here's the situation. Because sometimes you don't always have a parent there, at least in our situation, usually not, to be able to give you background information. So, it's just the teacher and then what's happening right there. And so sometimes you just have to try and pull them apart and say, okay, what is happening here? And, work really hard to get them to calm down. And then once they're calm, they can sort of come back to making those, being able to see reason as to what's going on and the acceptable amount of freak out that's happening.
Yeah. And I think being able to model just like not being brought to hysterics by something, like I think in part of it, like a kid will get upset because they know that it will give them like the attention and affection, like good things come from like making a display of being upset by a thing. And if you just kind of go like, oh, okay, well, we're fine, we're just gonna keep walking, like, you'll be okay, and just sort of like get them up, dust them off, and just like like, you're not gonna make a big deal of it. And you're like, no, I'm not, sorry.
Nope.
They have to like internalize that, and they're like, oh, okay, and that can be a little jarring for them sometimes, but I think it ends up better because then like you learn to self-soothe in a healthy way of like taking stock of what is going on with your body and your emotions and addressing it appropriately instead of just going to freak out mode. It's a really healthy thing for kids to learn. So yeah.
I think the other thing is just kids don't really have a lot of agency these days. And so kind of giving them that personal responsibility, like you are going to get somewhat hurt and it's up to you to decide what's an acceptable risk within these parameters of like, this is how you don't get seriously hurt. But within those parameters, it's up to you to decide what your risk level is going to be. And I think that goes a long ways towards having kids not act out.
Yeah, especially you see it with, I think, preschool through, or, you know, infancy through high school, in the way that kids are largely raised right now, is you have so much supervision and structure and very little room for them to like responsibly act of their own volition and have consequences for things that aren't enforced by parents, like natural consequence of, you know, injury, I lost something, like that sort of thing, where it's treated as like a fact of life that you now have to like address somehow, instead of just like, oh, you did a bad thing, this was bad, this was stupid, that like gets impressed by someone else. And it's kind of interesting because you go from high school where you're still being treated essentially as a child with very little agency, and then in high school, into college, where it's like, oh, you're an adult now, and watching people like struggle to make that adjustment of like, oh, I'm now a person who is responsible for myself and my environment. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big learning gap that nature and nature programs have an amazing opportunity to provide. Figure out how to do that is challenging.
I think there's also, at least from my perception, and this may not be everybody's experience, but there's also a lot more fear from the parent side as well about doing the wrong thing and getting sued, or as an educator, is because there's always the threat of this parent's going to sue you, that person's going to sue you, you messed up, this is going to, you know, and so then you're constantly, you know, for normal things, normal risks that happen, then there's constantly the threat of it being taken really far about, yeah. So then that's a challenge as well. Also, this is going to sound like a weird segue or a weird point to go on to, but this is another reason why I think it's important, like teaching kids how to be outside and with risk assessments. I think a way that helps that is to have a lot of team building activities outside as well, to really increase that culture. So that way you're having groups who are used to being together and you know, having that connection outside, so that way being able to get up and move on from the minor risks becomes a thing that the entire group shares with each other. And then that way it's almost like having positive peer pressure, so that way as a group you're used to kind of getting up and moving on. This is going to sound like kind of a weird story to connect this with. As a kid, one of my family members, and I'm not going to specify which one, tended to be very much prone to hysterics whenever I might show up with a scratch. And so she would say a lot, you know, maybe I shouldn't send you on those school camping trips, you know, you're going to get hurt. But because all of us as a group would look so forward to it, I didn't want to be away from my friends. I wanted to be going out with them and having these crazy adventures, and the idea of being kept at home just because of that was upsetting. And so I would insist upon going with my friends, because it wasn't just that we had a connection on the school play yard or whatever, we had a connection and stories to tell outside together. And so it can also create a positive feedback where the kids have that connection with each other, specifically in nature, and then they want to show up so that way they don't miss out on having this with their friends. Then there's the power of groups there. And random question, does anybody notice that entire groups of kids tend to be addicted to their screens, and so then that way the groups reinforce each other about, oh, I'd rather be on my screen?
Definitely. Yeah. I've noticed that coming into, Claire and I were homeschooled for a long time, then we were like reintegrated to other children, and during that gap, smartphones and like, you know, kids having personal electronics became a like really common thing that we were not really that literate with. And even though like we had access to stuff, we weren't using them the same way, like the way that people use social media to like socialize and like build social capital and interact, has always been something that I've really struggled with, because like I use Instagram. I don't like go and like all my friends' selfies because I don't follow anyone who posts endless streams of selfies. But watching other people use it, like they go through and they just scroll and they double tap everything, or like watching my ex use social media and the way that like there was this like exchange of like very kind of this currency of popularity, and watching how that, like, if you didn't play into it, then you wouldn't like get as involved with the group, because so much of the socializing happened in that medium. And even now it's really hard to like pull people my age out of that and be like, hey, do you want to do this? And like, oh, well, you know, it's like there are a group of people going. I'm like, no, do you want to just go on a walk with me and we can like talk? And, you know, both places they like take pictures, and it's like the whole thing of like, I need to like record the like whole thing of me being here and like the capital of that. And it's really interesting looking at how that affects group dynamics. And it definitely does reinforce it, because if you don't play into it, then you can end up being very much an outcast. And there's even a whole language to it. Like there's the whole meme language thing, which I mean, I don't really understand. And it was interesting even being with someone who was a few years older than me, going on a trip cross country, and she's like, you don't understand like any of the references that I'm making. And I'm like, I don't, because a lot of it comes from like internet memes that are from being like very kind of chronically on people using those terms as like, and the memes in part of like communication that is just like ingrained into that. And that's not something that I've ever been exposed to or been like, yeah. So it's definitely hard trying to break away from, it's like a shorthand. So.
And different ages have just such different references that it's hard to communicate between like age gaps.
Yeah, it's very strange.
I think one of the best things you can do is create like a really immersive experience. Like you were talking about kind of wading around in the river and having to learn sort of the safety with that and having to really be focused on that. And I think having stuff like that where you can't really be engaging with stuff like social media, but you have to be engaged with your surroundings and with the group. I think that goes a long ways towards sort of breaking out of that, at least temporarily.
Yeah, emerging from like the digital side of your life, because there's so much of it that happens. Like, I mean, even now, like there is a whole like social interaction that's taking place inside like the digital world that we're like immersed in right now. And with a lot of things, like it's so much of a bigger network where a lot of things happen in that digital world, and to completely like disengage from that and to like have to think in real time and be very fully cognizant of everything that's going on around you, I think that goes a long way in connecting people.
And learning how to use like different sort of skill sets and senses. Like, you know, we're so visual from being online, that really learning how to engage with something using different senses is so important. Like having kids pick stuff up and engage with their surroundings, and like just walk around in the mud and squish their toes in the grass. Like that's such an important thing, is engaging those different things and sort of engaging different parts of your brain.
That makes me think of some fun activities outside that involved blindfolds. You'd have one person with a blindfold, and then you'd have another person who goes around them and makes noises from various areas, and then the person has to point where the noise is coming from. That's something that you can't really duplicate with social media. And so I think, like you said, with immersive experiences, finding experiences that can't be duplicated on social media, that can only happen in real time, or ones where you make it clear that using social media to answer the question is totally cheating. So if you say, okay, we're going to do a memory game, look at this, either you can have them look at a fellow person or a neat plant or a neat bird or something, and then turn away and name certain features of it, but you can't take a picture because that's cheating. gamifying things can help.
The other thing too is me having this, there is no Wi-Fi, there is no data. There's nothing that they can grasp onto when they come to the field centers. One of the first questions they ask is, what's the internet password? And I go, there isn't any. And they're like, well, it's coming up. And I said, it's pretty much for the water system. So sorry. And I was like, even if you do have data, it's pretty limited in terms of what you're going to be able to get here. And my other thing is, for the most part, I tell them to put it away in your backpack for the day so that you don't lose it. Because I said, I don't field, phone calls from parents to go look for cell phones in 200 acres of land. Like, it's not happening. So I said, put it away. And because it's not the first time we've had parents expecting us to walk through the forest to look for their kid's cell phone. And I'm like, nope, it will not happen. So I said, you need your hands today, and you're just going to see it. And it's amazing what happens when you get them to finally take their earbuds out, put them in their backpack, put the cell phone in the backpack, and then just be in the moment. Like, the sound at lunchtime is pretty miraculous because they have nothing else to do except eat and talk to the other people at their table, right? And it's really amazing. And the kids that came today, like Sarah did let them have their cell phones, but it was a small group of kiddos that are from a space where they haven't had a lot of opportunities. And so it was balanced. I started taking videos sometimes and then sometimes not. But a lot of those kids, like today, was the first time they'd ever had a cooked marshmallow over a fire, or they've had a roasted hot dog. And so sometimes, I get it. Like, when we go to new places and we do new experiences, we take pictures too, right? So there's this interesting balance of, when is the right time and when isn't the right time to sort of have that piece of tech in there. And, my boss has a lot of these like one-liners that he says, but one of them is, it's the right tool for the right place, for the right age, for the right time. And sometimes those devices can be amazing. So sometimes I'm pulling out that device and the kid's like, what is this? I'm like, I don't know, but I wonder if we can figure it out, right? So instead of carrying around, loads of field books, maybe we can, take a picture of it and look at it that way. That's not the whole thing, but I might do that, once or twice. But then I'm like, nah, maybe we're just going to leave it at that. So, there's some interesting parts to it that I think there's a time and a place for it. And there's definitely a time and a place that you just put it in your backpack and use your hands and sort of experience, right? But I think it's a balance. And I think Kate's right. You can't really just like make it go away, because it's not going away, right? Like, we have to find some balance somewhere in and around there. And, my girls are coming up to an age where they're starting to ask for things like that. And I'm still just like, no, but baby, and so lots of conversations happening at our house because kids don't socialize the same way. Like, when I was in my eldest is in grade 5. And when I was in grade 5, we all lived close enough together that you just went outside to the neighbors and you knocked on the door and that's what you did. And we had house phones, so that you called on a house phone if you were like, what are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. Well, no one has house phones anymore. And so no one uses phone numbers anymore. And so they now chat with each other through social media, but there's still this part of me that's like, you're 10. Like, you're 10. Like, I don't know how comfortable I am. But at the same time, by not giving you that, am I alienating you from a summer with friends? Like, where's the balance that, myself and my husband have to sort of figure out with all of that stuff? There's a lot of stuff, right? And there's stuff that I don't want to be a part of, let alone her accidentally become a part of, right? So yeah, it's a balancing act for sure.
It's so hard because like, our parents went very much the like abstain from all of that route. And there's some really great things that came out of it. I think we're very nature literate. I think we have interests and abilities that a lot of people who were raised with a lot more that digital stuff don't have. The downside is we really struggle to connect with people our age. And
Yeah.
yeah.
On the other hand, I am looking back on it very glad that we didn't have that. Just because, I mean, at this point in my life, like, I don't want to be part of that. Like, as much as it is very much a social thing,
Yeah.
like, I think about how I feel when I'm using it and being able to compare that to how I felt when I didn't have access to that.
Yeah.
And it let me make a much more informed decision about how I want to behave on the internet and in what way to interact.
Yeah.
It's hard too, because without tech, none of us would be in this conversation.
Right.
So that's right. So there's this other really strange part of it is that, you know, I'm on the older scale of the tech things. Like cell phones really, you know, didn't become like a big deal until like my first year of university. And so even my brother, I find, who's 2 years younger, is much more sort of tech savvy and much more literate with that than I am. And even still, you know, there's this way that we can now keep in contact with people that we may have lost contact with throughout sort of life that is kind of good and kind of bad, right?
Yeah.
And then there's this other thing that, you know, through this community, I have met, you know, some of the most amazing people internationally that I would have never have had the chance of even crossing paths with without tech. So you know what I mean? Like, it's such a weird balance of things, because I couldn't imagine now having all of you in my life, not having all of you in my life. You know what I mean? Like, it's so bizarre, but I feel the way that we socialize on tech or through social media is quite different than, you know, a 15-year-old or, you know, something like that. So it's really interesting.
The way that you different groups online. Like I'm going to divide my digital life into about 3 groups. One is people who I know or at some point knew in real life who may have like reconnected and found me on a social media and followed me. So those are like people who I have a real connection to. And with those, I feel like there's like this pressure to show that like you're doing well and you're doing things. And then I have like a history group, which is just a bunch of people who are weirdly into the American Revolution. It's a great, not the same vibe as Nature Journal Club. It's really fun because there's no pressure to like perform or put on any sort of ingenuine persona to like make it seem like you're doing better than you are. It's just like connecting over something that you enjoy. And then like Nature Journal Club is the same way. It's like you're meeting with like-minded people. There's no sense of like competition or like, oh, I need to like, you know, I mean, I think it creates a community that engages in a really genuine way. Like, I mean, we're talking basically face to face, not like we're like messaging back and forth or like we're just like each other. I mean, it's a very personal thing that I think is close to like in-person interaction as you can get, is like just video calling, having conversations. And that's very different from how a lot of the like social networks online happen.
That's the culture surrounding different platforms as well, because I've got this one group that I've been friends with for a couple of years. We talk all the time, mostly through Discord chats. So we're not really face to face very often, but like we call and talk to each other, and it's very much just sort of conversation that's very genuine, like Kate was saying. But then I've tried like being friends with them on other platforms, and it does feel a lot more performative, even though it's the same people and you should have the same relationship with them. It's a very different kind of interaction.
I also find it very interesting that the people that I am closest with and have like those true friendships, that the conversation may start on social media and it immediately is like, you need to call me. And it flips right? From a social media perspective to like, I don't care what time it is, like you need to call me right now because we need to have a chat about this as opposed to, you know, a texting chat. Like I can only do so much of this before I'm like, can we just call? Or my friend's like, call me. Or all of a sudden the chat will just stop and the phone will ring, right? And so I don't know if that's like normal all the way through, or if that's just because I'm on the older end of things where I'm like, can we just chat? Like I'd rather talk, or if that's something that most people sort of end up doing. But you gotta like, yeah. So sometimes it'll start that way and then it'll evolve into, you know, sort of those old school like conversations.
That's something that I really push for, and I have kind of not gotten negative feedback, but people my age definitely think it's weird. Yeah, they're like, you want to talk face to face? I'm like, yeah, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So funny, right? Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we're all looking for connection. And I think the online platform gives us so many great opportunities for that.
Mhm.
It's hard to figure out how to like navigate that and how to manage the relationships in a way that feel like genuine and fulfilling instead of like this sort of shallow exchange. And a lot of the things I've had in like the large communities, people who like you see each other in person, but a lot of the socializing happens digitally. That's where it's felt really weird to me because there's like this performative side where like I was talking to some girl the other day and she's talking about seeing like her ex in someone else's Instagram story. And then she like posted this thing. She's like, I know that like this person will see it and this person will see it. So he'll know about it. Like, why?
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 That would exactly be my words, Kate. Why? Why?
That's
You know,
true.
social media, if we think of the word social, it's to be amongst, right? Like to be with. I don't
No.
think anywhere in social it says, you know, to get back at, to create revenge, you
Right?
know, like which is also something I find interesting on that as well, right?
I mean, if I'm going to commit an act of revenge, it is usually against the 13-year-old boy that I babysit and lift, and it is, well, usually just. There have been many forms of that. I've run him down on horseback and hit him with a foam sword. I've thrown him into a pond, but you know, that I feel like is appropriate revenge.
Chasing through the forest, yelling with a stick.
Has happened. Yeah. No, I think it's very difficult to manage relationships in that. It's confusing and it creates, I don't even know.
I think it does create a lot of more drama too because there's tone, right? Like I'm sure people have talked about that before. Eva is like, yes. Every time you get a message, you're like, what does that mean? Did they
Right?
mean it in a funny way? Did they mean it mad? Are they mad? What does that tone mean? And if they're anything like me who spells terribly and has terrible grammar, then nobody ever knows what I am saying. Or the fact that I am really loud. And so then in everything I write, there's a million exclamation marks. Ask Aveda when she gets an email from me, there's like 20,000 exclamation marks. People are like, why is she yelling? And I'm like, I'm not yelling. I'm just super excited. But it comes across as like, why are there so many exclamation marks, right? So, you know, tone, I think, is a big thing on any sort of media outlet as well. And I think that really creates a lot of frustration. And how do you have a meaningful conversation about your feelings if it's through typed word and you are not, you know, an author? I think it could really be troublesome. Yeah, go for it.
I also have to apologize if anybody ever gets annoyed by the messages I send, because I know that I tend to put hearts in my messages almost every single time I send a message. And the reason why I do that is so that people will know I have good intentions towards them. And it's my way of saying I care without stuttering over my words. But then some people might think that it's very childish because all my messages have hearts. But it's because I'm trying to communicate that I care, because I'm hoping it will influence the tone so that it's like, I care about you. And then they'll know that I'm not. Oh, go ahead, Kate, sorry.
Oh, I said that makes sense. Like I don't know, I always get frustrated with people when they send texts that have like a bunch of abbreviations and aren't like capitalized and aren't like, there's no punctuation. I'm like, what do you mean? Like if you get text from me, they usually have commas. I think I've adopted the 18th century style of capitalizing the first letter words that I find important because I just really liked that. Yeah. So I don't know, it's difficult. There's ways. Use punctuation.
I use emojis. I always think, oh my gosh, this looks so childish, but I always use like smiling emojis so everybody knows that I'm joking or I'm happy about this, again because of tone, right?
There's some
always so panicked about tone
that I'm confused by.
I use like 3: the heart emoji and the smiling emoji. Those are pretty much my 2 emojis that I use. Anything else makes pretty much 0 sense to me as like a human.
Emoji is usually used for, because she sent me some like, Mom, sending random emojis, but not to anybody else. Interpretation. Yeah.
I tend to use the laughing or the sweat drop smiling emoji a lot. I think the sweat drop smiling one where you get the sweat drop here and the person's like, you know, like that's my way of describing awkward smiling, trying to not let people notice that I'm freaking out because either we're talking on social media or I did something really dumb or something.
Yeah. There's like a handful of them that I use. Other than that, it's too much.
Actually, to add into like nature journaling stuff is to try and like bring some of that literacy, like with emojis and stuff, into nature journals of like, you know, draw your reaction to this thing with like a little emoji face. Yeah.
A friend of mine here at work used emojis, and I sort of adopted that from her. And so what she did was at the beginning of a nature journaling session, ask the kids to think about how they're feeling in that moment. Are they sad? Are they hungry? Are they fearful? You know, are they uncertain about what's going to happen? And then characterize those feelings in an emoji, because emojis are, for the most part, pretty universal. And then we get them to revisit that emoji at the end of the session and to see if that emotion has changed at all. And it's a great way to sort of integrate mindfulness and sort of mental well-being, and to really get it to hit home about what it can do for your mental health to spend time in nature and to slow down and sort of have some brain breaks. Because most of the kids, not everybody, it's not like it's a cure for all, but I would say, 95% of them go from maybe I'm sleepy, I'm hungry, I'm tired, whatever, to excited, that was fun, I'm loving it, and really, can I use more than one emoji? Like, yes, of course you can. To really get them to get a sense of self during those times. And it's a great way to, it's pretty universal, right? So it's a nice way of doing it.
Yeah. Plus they do the whole thing of like getting them to put themselves into the narrative of like tell ourselves like our own little stories of like what is going on in our lives and what we're doing. And I think being able to like add to that self narration is really important in like forming those experiences, especially how they remember things. And yeah.
Chris just put in the chat, she said emoji as metadata for the observer of nature. What a great thing to just add into the metadata, right? It's something that we automatically do. That's a really great one.
Oh, totally. But like, especially like if you have kids for a longer period of time and you're doing that and you're like, okay, remember, like you may not be super enthusiastic about doing this now, but like look at your emojis. Like, remember last time we did this? Like,
Plus,
you worked into it and then we did the thing and all of a sudden you're excited,
Plus, it's kind of an interesting way of bridging that sort of online literacy with being out in nature journaling, is that it in a way, emojis, I find them kind of inspiring in a way when I think about things like sketchnoting, because sketchnoting is a lot about relying on shorthand and icons. And so being able to have an idea of what a visualization can look like shorthand is kind of nice. So that could even be a thing, that could even be a fun activity, is that instead of relying on your phone, then you have to create your own nature emojis for the things that you're seeing outside. So a redwood emoji, how would you create that? a bumblebee emoji. And so then you kind of get kids making their own language for the outdoors by using the emojis and the symbols with that.
I just also thought about little signs that you use for how something smells and how something feels, you know, so that you're not having to use whole words, just a quick,
He was asking the question whether or not there is a good in nature emoji out there right now. And so she's wondering about a wildflower maybe. But I don't know if there's anything like specific. I do always struggle to find emojis that have to do with nature specifically, other than like the classic bee, butterfly, flower sort of thing. So I'm not sure. But again, I don't spend a lot of time looking at them either.
I think you can make custom keyboards. So maybe I'll start looking into like making emojis that are like ecosystem specific, because that would be very helpful.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
That actually be a really cool project for like a group of kids. If you had them for a long time, like doing the nature journal thing, it's like, yeah, let's like make a keyboard thing and like, you know, turn those into digital. I think it'd be a lot of work, but who knows, for like a high school group, that could be a really cool project.
Yeah.
Way of just sort of bridging, I mean, like cultural but also age gaps.
Yeah,
because like it's kind of odd, like there's this perception of emojis as sort of like this young person thing, but comparatively I see like older people using emojis way more than I see people who are like my age or a few years younger using them. And there's this whole other language that people like a few years younger than me have to convey emotions. But emojis, they do work really well, just sort of to bridge that gap.
I will say that from the time that emojis first became a thing, there's been a lot more variety in emojis nowadays. So they're adding to it, but it would still be really fun to do more place-based ones. So I agree with that. Here's a question. With kids who are either nature reluctant or screen addicted, are there any really good kind of high percentage beginning activities that you would do with them to help them get more integrated quickly? Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Kate.
Well, you all know my thing for history, and one of the reasons I love nature journaling is like people didn't always have, you know, wildlife photography things. So I think it'd be really fun to like do a little tech break and go like, okay, we're gonna like put this away and we're gonna pretend that like we're exploring this area for the first time. We're gonna record all this data to bring back, and how are we gonna do that? Because I mean, the thing is, people can live without tech. It's not like, you know, they're going to have serious withdrawal illness if you pull them away from their phone. Like in my experience with the tech addicted kid that I've worked with, if you pull him away from that and go, okay, you are not going to get to play with your technology right now, we are doing something different, like eventually he does engage with what's in front of him and he's just fine. Like there's whining, but once you like, oh, we're not doing that, I'm sorry, you know, we're doing this thing. Like that kind of sets a precedent of like, how do you interact with the world when you don't have this like thing that, you know, especially with people who like video everything, it's like you're seeing everything through this little screen and you need to like put it down and like see it in real life, you know, and think like, how are you going to remember it? And that's like the nature journal entryway. So yeah.
I feel like something that could be fun is like dividing kids into groups and then giving them a specific like plant, especially like if it's something edible, like something they can actively engage with in a way that they're not usually engaging with the world. And then giving them field guides and just sending them off into an area and being like, try and find this and bring it back. And then using that as sort of a way to teach looking at things in a different way and interpreting features.
Yeah. That map making, or another good one would be to take kids into this place where it's just like you want them to get dirty Take kids bushwhacking,
Yes.
where they have to crawl around and find their own little path through there, and there's no way you can have your phone out. Well,
Bushwhacking.
I say that as I took a video of, anyways, yeah.
Another fun one can be hiding little treasures around and then having people find them, scavenger hunt, or else maybe you have, I don't know, a random thing that I used to like to do with my son in our little backyard area, which isn't even, it's more like a concrete area with a bunch of potted plants, is that I had these figurines of dinosaurs and also megafauna. So I would take a hippopotamus and we would hide it and we would take turns trying to find it. And I liked hiding it in the foliage so it looked like it was eating the foliage. And then he'd have to figure out which plant the hippo was trying to eat. And so that can be kind of fun, hiding things around and then telling people to go find them. Plus then it gets them moving around the environment a lot more, searching for a specific thing so that they're a little bit less self-conscious about walking out in the bushes.
Yeah. I guess also me giving like props to take the place of like having the tech and stuff, like here's some binoculars, here's, your nature wall, like here's this new thing for you to play with and engage with. Like
it's good, yeah. New toy or new tool, but except that the toy is a magnifying glass, and then they're like, I want to magnify everything.
But that's what kids do, and that's great. Like, you give them some new thing, and once they figure out how to use it, they're gonna use it till they are burned out on it. But
And the other thing too is just for those nature-averted kids, they tend to also be like nervous, or they have like an excessive amount of energy. And so just walk them, hike them, let them explore, but give all the same prompts that you would. Like, what are you noticing? What questions are we wondering? Blah, blah, blah. Before you even enter into the world of paper and pencil, you really sort of want to get like really good minds on, but at the same time, you want to decrease some of that amount of energy by, playing a few games as you kind of roll out, getting them to sort of think about stuff, and then, coming back to sort of that space, because no kid with a lot of energy or who is nervous is going to sit in the forest and nature journal right off the bat, especially if they've never done it before. It's just not going to happen, right? And so I also think you, as the facilitator or instructor, need to be aware of the students who are coming and be prepared to be flexible in those situations and be like, okay, so this isn't working, so we're going to do this instead. So maybe we're just going to do the I notice, and we're going to walk for a while afterwards, and then maybe we'll pop in, a few I wonders or whatever it is. But I think really reading your group, I think, is a big thing as well, which I think is, something that I like to do with the kids as well.
And then I was also thinking I Spy challenges can be fun too,
mm-hmm.
especially then when the kids get to start choosing the thing that they spy.
Mm-hmm.
But what else? What other kinds of activities? Because I think it's good to have several options, so that way you can change it up, like Billy Joe was just saying. So so are there others? Because I think brainstorming is fun.
Here's the game Animal, Mineral, Vegetable, with a wide range of age groups and situations. It's a good way to like expand knowledge and also like make people think about like what they're talking about, because all of a sudden if someone's like, if the object is a goose, they may not have thought about too much, like, okay, it's a bird, yes, is it bigger or smaller than this? And it's like you have all these questions that like talk about descriptive stuff and like, does it live in water? Can it fly? Like, and there's just like it really inspired like that question asking. And I think you can like take that elsewhere into the field, which is great. Yeah.
That's right. I used to love that game as a kid. That's a really good point about how it increases the asking questions.
Yeah.
Which is one of the biggest skills. So that's an excellent idea. Animal, mineral, vegetable, if I can say it right today.
There you go.
Are there, I'm realizing that the time is 1:34, but I could keep talking about this forever. But are there any other activities or thoughts that folks have? I want to make sure that I'm not closing the discussion before anybody has if somebody has any big thing that they wanted to say, then I wanted to make sure everybody got a chance. So yeah, any other thoughts about nature reluctant or screen addicted kiddos? No? Okay. We could always talk about this again later. In that case, I'm excited. I love that we have activities now that we can try with them. I'm going to be trying them with my son, I know. We'll close out. So folks know, I'm not sure. I've been looking for the Zoom recording of our first session that involved summer activities, and I can't find it, which is really unfortunate because that was a very rich discussion. I do have the discussion from last week with Lindsay, and I'm about halfway through editing it, so it should be up by the end of today. And I'll make sure that I get this one up as well, assuming nothing happens to the recording. Do you hear me, technology gods? This is another reason why maybe we're not so into technology, is because people think it's all like perfect and that you can get all your memories. No, technology lets us down a whole bunch. Technology is like, ha ha, you thought I was going to save that memory? Ha ha, rely on your actual memory, silly geese. And then it drops the memory. Then you're going, okay, yeah. I was tricked. So I don't know where I was going with that. Anyways, it's really, really fabulous to see all of you today. Take care, everybody. See y'all soon.